There are places on Earth so quiet, you can almost hear the sand drifting with the wind. There are creatures that spend their entire lives hidden in darkness, and humans have only just discovered them. And there are mysteries that, the deeper you explore, the more beautifully strange this world becomes. Welcome to Relaxed Story, a place where we do not rush, where things are not loud. We simply slow down for a little while together to explore nature, hidden mysteries, and sometimes a few facts that make you quietly say, "Wait, seriously." Now then, get comfortable. Our journey is about to begin. Above the final cloud layer of southern Nepal, where the edge of the Tibetan plateau begins lifting the earth itself toward the thin, frozen atmosphere of the planet, the Himalayas no longer resemble a mountain range, nor a landscape humanity ever truly belonged to. Ice-covered ridges extend across the horizon like an ancient continental wall, raising the weather systems of Asia high above the world below. The clouds do not cover the summit ridges, they drift beneath them. Vast rivers of vapor move slowly under the frozen peaks, like oceans flowing beneath a geological architecture that existed long before many of the first civilizations appeared. Cold light reflects from glacier surfaces, creating pale blue-white openings between deep mountain shadows, where glacier valleys unfold like glowing fractures buried inside stone. There are no human voices here, no interruption forcing itself into that ancient silence, only high-altitude wind passing across frozen rock faces. Space so immense that sound itself seems to lose weight, and the distant croon of old ice shifting deep inside the mountains. From this altitude, the Himalayas no longer feel like a landscape to observe. They feel like an atmospheric barrier redirecting monsoon systems, a colossal climate engine bending the movement of air across an entire continent, an ancient tectonic structure still rising millimeter by millimeter beneath the slow pressure of colliding plates. The scale of the system is so immense that every trace of civilization below begins to lose meaning. The viewer is not looking at a place waiting to be conquered. They are looking into a planetary mechanism that had already been operating long before humans learned to give names to mountains. As the cloud layer slowly lowers itself away from the coldest summits, the final traces of the human world begin to emerge beneath it. Terraced fields appear like fragile cuts carved into vast mountain slopes. Stone villages huddle together beneath the cold shadow of cliff walls, morning smoke rising slowly from dark rooftops before dissolving into the thin air. Narrow Sherpa trails become so small from this distance that they resemble cracks running along the sides of vertical mountains. Water still moves through stone here. Yak bells echo across the early mist. Wind brushes over rock roofs with a soft, low sound, as though the mountain itself is breathing slowly in a frozen sleep stretching across millennia. Domesticated yaks appear only as silhouettes moving through silver morning fog. So small, they seem almost absorbed by the landscape itself. The trails reveal that humans have spent centuries attempting to move deeper into the Himalayas, yet they remain held within the lower layers of this ecosystem, where oxygen is still dense enough for human lungs, where fire still burns steadily, where trees can still maintain their height. This is the final breathing layer of the human world before the environment gradually begins rejecting every form of life that consumes too much energy to survive. Higher still, warmth disappears first, then vegetation density. Finally, the familiar soundscape of lower elevations fades away. Dense conifer forests begin thinning across colder mountain slopes, giving way to smaller and more fragile subalpine woodlands. The trees do not die suddenly. They slowly exhaust themselves. Trunks bend permanently beneath years of relentless winter wind. Roots emerge from cold stone like stiffened hands gripping the final thin layers of soil. The tree line does not form a clean boundary. It hesitates. It pauses, then retreats little by little beneath the pressure of lower temperatures, stronger ultraviolet radiation within the thin atmosphere, constant winds stripping heat from the ground, and snow lingering too long for saplings to survive successive cold seasons. The Himalayas do not destroy life through violence. They wear life down through prolonged exposure to altitude. Above the final line of trees, biology first appears not as presence, but as traces. A Himalayan griffin circles high within cold thermal currents, its wings scarcely moving through the thin air. It drifts in slow, silent spirals through the upper winds, using the atmospheric structure of the Himalayas themselves to conserve energy. On the ground, alpine grasses have been grazed down to the stone. Old hoofprints remain frozen inside melting snow, like fading symbols left behind by creatures no longer visible. Dry ungulate droppings line narrow mountain paths where no tree large enough to cast shade still exists. A pika calls once from the talus rocks, then disappears immediately into the cold emptiness. Its tiny body never fully reveals itself. In the Himalayas, life rarely exposes itself completely. It exists as echo, as fleeting motion, as evidence that something is still resisting altitude within this world of stone and ice. Then a cold cloud front begins crawling across the mountain face. The valley below slowly disappears beneath a rising atmosphere of white vapor climbing from the abyss beneath. The yak bells vanish first, then chimney smoke. Finally, even the narrow trails disappear from sight. The soundscape is reduced to wind pressure, forcing itself through stone cracks. The distant shifting of rock within the cold, and the hollow emptiness of thin air above the weather layer. And when the clouds finally dissolve again, the villages no longer exist within the frame of this world. The documentary has now entered another layer of the biosphere, where the logic of survival is no longer shaped by civilization, but by altitude, oxygen, and cold exposure. Above the last villages, the forest does not end suddenly. It hesitates. It lowers itself. It becomes shrub, shadow, root, and finally, silence. Higher into the mountains, the valleys carrying the final traces of human presence begin sinking beneath the landscape like memories losing warmth. The sound of water moving beside wooden homes, livestock shifting through narrow mountain paths, thin smoke drifting upward from villages buried deep within the ravines. All of it slowly dissolves into the colder emptiness above. The Himalayas no longer feel like a mountain range that can be inhabited. They begin transforming into a climate system, separating itself from the lower world. Between roughly 3,000 and 4,000 meters, the forest does not disappear abruptly. There is no clean divide between trees and cold stone. The canopy simply begins thinning, then breaking apart into isolated clusters scattered across immense slopes. Dwarf rhododendrons press themselves close to the ground as though hiding from the wind. Dark, low juniper shrubs cling tightly to frozen rock crevices, where the final traces of moisture remain after the long winter. Every trunk becomes more twisted, lower, slower, as though altitude itself is forcing all life downward against the earth. The ground above the tree line is no longer soft. It fractures into unstable scree slopes, constantly sliding beneath gravity. Cracks holding old snow weeks after the last storm, and small alpine grasses growing between layers of lichen spread across grey stone. Even the light changes here. It sharpens, it cools, it reflects violently from distant snowfields and pale rock beneath the thin atmosphere. Wind no longer exists as background sound. It becomes the dominant force shaping the entire space, sweeping endlessly across exposed slopes, carrying cold severe enough that every biological structure must shrink itself in order to survive. As elevation increases, the soil loses its ability to retain heat. Ultraviolet radiation intensifies, and roots struggle to anchor themselves within ground continuously shifting beneath melting ice and broken stone. Saplings surviving one winter often lack the energy to survive the next. The Himalayas do not truly erase forests. They simply force vegetation to surrender its height. Everything becomes lower, slower, closer to the rock, as though the entire ecosystem is learning how to survive by reducing its own presence. As the final openings appear between scattered clusters of trees, smaller forms of life begin replacing the ecological role once held by the forest itself. Alpine grasses remain pressed against the earth, absorbing the rare sunlight of the short summer. Cushion plants, round and dense like living stones, preserve warmth inside their compact structures. Lichen spreads slowly across cold rock until it becomes difficult to tell where mineral ends and organism begins. Dwarf rhododendrons bend low against the ground to escape the constant force of wind moving across open slopes. Juniper roots push deep into narrow fractures, holding the final remnants of moisture left behind after snowmelt. Nothing within this vegetation system contains excess. Every structure feels compressed into survival beneath the pressure of altitude. Summer here is so brief, it resembles nothing more than a single breath between winters. Within those few weeks, plants must complete their entire biological cycle. They must photosynthesize, store energy, produce seeds, sustain roots, and prepare for months of freezing stillness ahead. Some alpine herbs remain active for such a short period that their existence resembles an event more than a true growing season. The space above the tree line also becomes quiet in a different way. Almost no insect sounds remain, only low wind moving through stone slopes, the distant cracking of ice or contracting rock in the cold, and sometimes the solitary cry of a bird descending from the empty air above. It is within this thin and diminished vegetation zone that the first herbivores of the high Himalayas begin to appear, nearly dissolving into the landscape itself. At first, an alpine slope appears entirely empty. Only grey stone, cold shadow, and steep inclines stretching upward into low cloud. Then one animal subtly turns its head. Light catches the curve of a pale horn for only a few seconds, and from terrain that moments earlier seemed lifeless, an entire herd of barrels slowly emerges as though they had always been part of the mountain itself. Their blue-grey coats blend almost perfectly with scree fields and cold mountain shadows. They live across treeless alpine meadows and exposed slopes above the timberline, always remaining close to cliffs steep enough for them to disappear within seconds if danger appears. They move with a balance between sheep and mountain goat, stable enough for broken stone, agile enough to climb narrow ledges where most mammals cannot stand. The burrowel graze slowly, no wasted movement, no unnecessary activity. Every step conserves energy as though winter already waits beneath the cold rock. One young animal slips slightly across loose scree. The entire herd freezes immediately. No panic, no frantic escape. They simply move several meters higher, closer to the cliff edge, then become completely motionless. A shadow passes across the mountainside, perhaps a Himalayan griffin, perhaps a golden eagle descending from the upper ridges. The burrowel do not run. They become stone. Within this collapsing tree-lined world, survival no longer belongs to speed or dominance. It belongs to restraint, to the ability to disappear into the environment, to the discipline of remaining still long enough for the world itself to stop noticing your presence. Above the forest, the Himalayas do not become empty. They simply become more difficult to see. Everything grows colder, quieter, more compressed into stone and wind. Life still exists here, but lower, slower, closer to the earth, almost completely dissolved into the ancient landscape, continuing to rise toward the thin atmosphere above. But higher still, the slope becomes too steep for forests, too unstable for roots, and almost too vertical for mammals. Almost. The farther the Himalayas rise above the alpine meadows below, the more the mountain begins to lose the very idea of flatness. Sparse shrub zones slowly fade behind the ascent. The grazing grounds, where burrowel once moved like scattered green brushstrokes across the slopes, sink beneath the cold haze of altitude, giving way to a world where the entire landscape begins to stand upright against the thinning sky. Between roughly 2,500 and well above 5,000 meters, the terrain no longer unfolds outward. It drops away beneath itself, as though the mountain is constantly trying to pull every living thing from its surface. Immense cliff walls fractured by time stretch upward through low cloud. Corridors of broken stone lie wedged between dark fissures. Unstable scree shifts endlessly under the pressure of melting ice and cold wind, while narrow ledges, barely wide enough to hold a living body, hang suspended inside the pale emptiness of cliff ecology. Here, gravity no longer feels like an invisible law hidden behind the physical world. It becomes an environmental force in itself, present in every footstep, pulling downward without rest, testing balance without pause, forcing each body to calculate even the smallest movement in exchange for oxygen. The geometry of the world changes with the terrain. The soft, horizontal flow of meadows and open valleys disappears entirely. Everything now operates vertically. Cliff escarpments rise through cloud. Fractured rock shelves hang over cold voids that seem almost endless, and the landscape itself begins to feel tilted beneath the observer's feet. The wind grows drier, sharper, compressed between stone corridors until it echoes through the canyon in long, hollow currents. Most sound vanishes from the mountain. Only wind sheer scraping across cliff walls remains, along with the faint slide of loose rock disappearing into the depths below. and the distant aftershock of unseen rockfall rolling through the thin air of altitude. In these Himalayan heights, steep terrain is not simply a feature of the landscape. It is the final refuge from predator pressure, from human presence far below, from the open exposure of larger valleys where big bodies are easier to detect. But the same terrain also turns existence into a constant examination of balance, footing, and oxygen conservation. Every step consumes energy. Every unnecessary movement carries the possibility of falling hundreds of meters onto cold stone. And within a landscape where most lowland animals would slip or collapse from exhaustion within minutes, a different ungulate begins to emerge, as though the cliffs themselves are shaping living bodies out of stone and mist. A female Himalayan tahr steps out from the shadow line of the cliff. Another body appears behind her. Then gradually, an entire small herd materializes among dark rock, old snow, and shifting patches of cloud shadow moving across the mountain face. From a distance, they almost dissolve into the terrain itself, difficult to separate from the weathered gray of altitude. Tahr live across rocky slopes and subalpine cliffs stretching from Kashmir to Bhutan, usually near the tree line where most large vegetation has already disappeared from the mountain. Their bodies are dense, muscular, built low against gravity itself. Short legs keep their center of mass close to the slope, reducing instability across constantly angled terrain, while their hooves combine soft, rubber-like inner pads with sharp, hardened outer edges capable of gripping ledges nearly impossible for most other creatures to stand upon. Large males carry thick manes across the neck, shoulders, and chest, trapping warmth against the cold wind of exposed cliffs, while making their silhouettes appear larger during the brief breeding season of the high mountains. But the documentary does not frame them simply as another mountain goat species. They appear instead as direct products of vertical geology itself, as though thousands of years of gravity, cold stone, and relentless slope have slowly carved a body capable of surviving upon surfaces that barely allow life at all. The herd moves across the cliff face with a slowness that feels almost meditative. Each step is short, steady, mathematically precise. No individual runs without reason. No movement is wasted through panic or display. Within cliff ecology, survival does not belong to speed. It belongs to precision. They feed during dawn and dusk, when temperatures soften and lower light reduces heat stress across exposed slopes. During midday, the herd rests upon wind-facing rocky shelves, places far more difficult for predators to approach than the meadows below. They feed on alpine grasses, sedges, and scattered vegetation clinging to sun-facing slopes, extracting life from every small patch still capable of surviving between cold stone. One large male stands slightly above the rest of the herd. Wind pulls the thick mane backward like dry grass caught inside an old snowstorm. It watches the valley for a long time, not like a dominance display, not like predator awareness. The stare carries the feeling of constant environmental calculation, as though the mountain itself is thinking through the body standing there. In the Himalayas, cliffs are not obstacles. They are defense architecture, predator filters, geography optimized for energy conservation in a world where every calorie matters. But even bodies shaped for steepness never fully control the mountain. Because here, stone is always moving, always collapsing, always reminding every living thing that gravity never sleeps. A section of scree suddenly breaks loose from a shelf above. The sound of stones striking the canyon echoes across the cold walls, like the cracking of the landscape itself. The entire herd stops instantly. No panic, no stampede, only stillness. A young tahr must cross a narrow fracture ahead. There is no orchestral tension, no artificial drama forced into the silence. Only the soft impact of hooves against dry stone, the faint shifting of gravel beneath the small weight of the young body, and the thin wind sliding continuously across the cliff wall. The mother stands above. She does not rush downward to rescue it. There is no human-shaped emotion in her behavior. She simply holds position, waiting for instinct to complete the same process that thousands of winters before had already completed countless times. When the young one finally crosses the gap, the entire scene returns immediately to its moving silence, as though nothing had happened at all. In the Himalayas, victory is rarely loud, rarely dramatic. Most of the time, success is simply a single step that did not fail. And slowly, the mountain begins revealing its deeper logic. The Himalayas do not select life only through cold, low oxygen, or scarce food. They also select through geometry itself. Creatures unable to read slope, unable to control movement, unable to conserve energy disappear from this vertical world long before the first winter ends. The documentary now leaves meadow ecology behind entirely and enters the systems of cliff survival, where life is no longer measured by strength, but by the ability to exist between gravity and empty space. Yet not all life above the forests is large enough to command the slope. Beneath these hooves, inside the broken stone, smaller hearts are preparing for a winter that has already begun. The cliff walls, once crossed by the Himalayan tahr, slowly disappear behind the cold haze of altitude. The barren ridgelines that once stretched outward like the edge of a vertical world now collapse inward toward the ground, where the scale of the Himalayas is no longer measured through deep valleys or immense walls of stone, but by the width of a crack between two slabs of dark frozen granite. Between roughly 3,500 and 5,000 meters, the mountain no longer exists as a vast panorama. It becomes broken, tailless slopes shaped by time. Silver-gray scree fields scattered across the surface, twisted roots buried beneath thin soil, and narrow fractures where cold air lingers for hours after sunlight has already disappeared. The wind here is weaker than along the exposed cliff faces. The long currents that once echoed across barren escarpments fade away. Yet the cold feels deeper because the air settles between the rocks, as though the mountain is keeping small pockets of winter hidden inside itself. Sound changes with the scale of the terrain. The immense resonance of plateau wind dissolves into tiny collisions of stone, the soft friction of dry grass beneath thin air, faint gravel shifting somewhere beneath the scree slope, and short, nearly invisible calls appearing briefly between rock fissures before vanishing back into silence. These talus fields are not simply remnants of geological erosion. Between millions of broken stones exists an entire miniature climate system, where narrow voids preserve rare traces of moisture, where underground tunnels maintain temperatures far more stable than the exposed surface continually scorched by daytime radiation before freezing again moments after sunset. In the Himalayas, As the environment becomes harsher, life does not disappear. It contracts. It sinks deeper between the rocks. It becomes quieter, smaller, more difficult to notice, as though all high-altitude biology is compressing itself in order to continue surviving beneath layers of ancient cold wind. Inside cracks, where sunlight touches the stone for only a few hours each day, where temperatures change simply because a cloud passes across the sun, small creatures begin living as though the entire summer were nothing more than a brief preparation for the cold slowly returning from the glacial peaks above. A Himalayan pika appears near the dark edge of a scree opening. It stands perfectly still. Small ears rise into the thin air, while whiskers tremble faintly against the cold currents moving through the rocks. Its grey-brown fur almost disappears into granite shadow, old lichen staining the stone, and the alpine gravel stretching beneath the mountain. Only the smallest movement of breath reveals that this is not simply another silent part of the landscape. Pikas are not rodents. They are close relatives of rabbits and hares, small alpine lagomorphs adapted to cold mountain rock systems. They live inside talus fields, deep within scree fractures beneath the surface, where temperatures remain far more stable than the exposed stone above, constantly shifting between freezing cold and intense atmospheric sunlight. Unlike many other high-altitude animals, pikas do not hibernate. Because of that, the brief summer becomes their entire season of preparation for winter survival. Their small bodies are especially vulnerable to temperature extremes. If exposed rock heats too much beneath the thin sunlight of altitude, activity above the talus must stop almost immediately. Survival for pika does not depend on strength or speed, but on shade selection, timing, choosing the correct crevice with suitable temperature, and moving with enough precision to avoid wasting precious energy inside an environment that allows almost no mistakes. As the rare warm weeks begin passing across the mountain, the pika lowers itself into short alpine grass and drags small stems through openings in the rock. It disappears beneath the dark fracture below the scree slope. Seconds later, it emerges again, pulling another strand behind it. The action repeats endlessly, almost hypnotically, as though the entire rhythm of this tiny creature's existence consists only of slow accumulation, repeated hundreds of times each day. This is haying behavior, a form of winter architecture built from fragments of grass. Vegetation is gathered, dried naturally inside the cold, dry air of the Himalayas, then stored deep beneath the rocks in hidden hay piles. These small mounds are more than food reserves. Over time, they also become rare pockets of nutrient accumulation within the exhausted alpine soils of high elevation, where even decaying plant fragments carry enormous biological value. But in the Himalayas, no stored resource is ever completely safe. A sudden sharp sound cuts through the cold talus corridor. Alarm call. Instantly, all movement disappears from the landscape. No grey fur flickers between the stones. No ears rise above the fractures. No tiny footsteps move across the dry gravel. Only rock, cold shadow, and thin wind passing across the scree field remain. Pika form the foundation of food systems for many alpine predators, high-altitude foxes, small mustelids living between the stones, and birds of prey circling high above the cold atmosphere. Across the talus slope, a large shadow glides through the pale light of late afternoon. Perhaps a Himalayan griffin, perhaps a golden eagle drifting along thermal currents near the cloud edge. But the predator never fully appears. It exists only as invisible pressure suspended above the landscape, as though the sky itself is listening for movement beneath the rocks. 1 second earlier, the mountain still carried heartbeat. The next second, the Himalayas return to a state that feels entirely empty. Life has not disappeared from this place. It has simply compressed itself through each layer of altitude. Forests have already fallen far below. Large movement fades away. Existence now survives beneath goldstone, dependent on preparation, timing, and restraint inside a world where winter is always longer than summer. The Himalayas do not erase life through violence. They make life smaller, quieter, more careful, until an entire creature becomes little more than a tiny heartbeat, still trying to survive beneath the cold stone of an ancient planet. And above these small hidden stores, above the slopes where hooves touch stone and vanish, the air begins to belong to wings, hunger, and the predators that move without wasting breath. The rocky slopes where pika colonies once vanished between endless talus fields now begin to fall far below, dissolving into the cold haze of altitude where hidden hay piles tucked inside stone fractures no longer appear at all. The mountain continues lifting its world upward, beyond alpine rocky slopes littered with sharp shattered stone, beyond silver-grey escarpments rising like ancient walls, beyond dark corridors buried inside cliff shadows where sunlight can no longer fully reach. Between 4,000 and more than 5,000 meters above sea level, the landscape begins to lose nearly every familiar trace of soft life. No tall trees remain, no large shrubs survive, no damp ground holds warmth beneath the sun. Only endless scree fields remain, fractured rock broken apart by thousands of years of freezing and thawing. Wind-polished slopes, so cold their reflected light feels almost sharp. And old patches of snow lingering between seasons like memories the mountain has not yet allowed to disappear. The light here never softens. It rebounds violently from snow crust, pale granite, and shards of buried ice scattered through the stone, leaving the entire world feeling both empty and painfully bright. Yet beneath that silver-white glare, the shadows deepen beyond what seems natural blue-gray, silent, almost watchful, as if the landscape itself is withholding something it refuses to reveal too soon. Even the soundscape has nearly vanished. No insects vibrate through the air anymore. No distant resonance of water moves through lower meadows. No continuous biological motion drifts through alpine grasses. Only wind threading through stone gaps, the faint slide of dry snow across steep surfaces, and occasional pebble echoes breaking loose somewhere inside distant cliff bands. The Himalayas no longer exist as a background for life. The mountain itself has become concealment architecture, a vast terrain system designed to hide its predator. And at elevations where oxygen itself begins to become a biological limitation, every unnecessary movement becomes dangerous even for the apex predator of the mountain. A snowy slope appears almost entirely empty. For several long seconds, nothing moves among the cold stone and unmoving shadow bands stretched across the mountainside. Then the eyes appear, not through sudden motion, not through a dramatic cinematic reveal. They are simply there, between rock and snow, as if they had always belonged to the landscape, long before the observer noticed them. The snow leopard does not seem to enter the frame. It feels as though it separates itself from the mountain. Its silver-gray fur, covered in muted rosette patterns, dissolves almost perfectly into the broken terrain surrounding it. Cold shadow bands crossing its body resemble fracture lines running through stone. Thin snow gathered along cliff edges erases parts of its outline entirely. This is one of the most refined camouflage systems ever formed inside mountain ecosystems, evolved not for open pursuit across wide landscapes, but for invisibility within fractured terrain. The long, heavy tail behind it constantly maintains balance across inclined stone, then wraps around the body during long periods of exposure beneath the brutal cold. Wide fur-covered paws function like natural snowshoes, spreading weight across soft snow, reducing sinking, while nearly eliminating all noise from each step. Enlarged nasal cavities warm the freezing air before it reaches the lungs, reducing thermal shock in the thin atmosphere where every breath carries real survival value. The documentary does not define this predator through aggression, not through explosive strength, not through roaring or intimidation. It is defined through stillness, patience, and near-total invisibility. In the Himalayas, where every uphill movement burns oxygen faster than the body can recover it, hunting is no longer a prolonged chase. It becomes a calculation of distance, slope angle, wind direction, and absolute patience. The snow leopard does not hunt like wolves. It does not rely on endurance pursuits across open terrain. The hunting logic here operates through elevation advantage, ambush geometry, terrain concealment, and almost perfect timing. A failed attack is not merely a lost opportunity. It becomes an energy deficit inside an ecosystem already suffering from severe scarcity, an increased risk of starvation, and dangerous oxygen expenditure at altitudes where recovery happens slowly. Because of this, most of the predator's existence is not spent moving, but remaining motionless. It watches. It stands for hours along frozen ridgelines. It waits for shifting wind directions to drag scent downhill toward lower slopes. It calculates the spaces between rock shadows, blind ridges, and prey pathways before committing to movement. The terrain is no longer simply where the hunt occurs. The terrain itself becomes the hunting weapon. Wind drags scent downward. Snow conceals foot impact. Shadows destroy body outlines. The Himalayas actively participate in the hunt. This is no longer predator against prey. Predator and mountain system now function as a single organism. Far below the cliff shadows, where the predator nearly disappears from perception, a herd of burrell grazes exposed grass patches, emerging through thin snow cover. They choose wind-sheltered slopes near escape routes, where only a few leaps can carry them onto dangerous broken ledges. Their blue-gray coats blend almost perfectly into the scree slopes, mirroring the exact camouflage logic used by the predator above them. The entire ecosystem functions through stillness, terrain blending, and the art of dissolving into the environment itself. Higher along a distant ridge, a Himalayan tar appears only as a dark silhouette against the cold silver light. Behind these invisible predator roots, ravens and choughs circle slowly through the thin air. They do not hunt, they wait. Scavenger ecology always exists behind predator silence, because in the Himalayas there is no excess abundance. Every death eventually becomes redistributed energy for the rest of the ecosystem. Then beneath the cold reflected light of snow and the bottomless blue-gray shadows, the landscape finally reveals movement that until now seemed non-existent. The snow leopard descends through hidden ridges and narrow shadow corridors between stone walls. Its steps remain low, soft, almost soundless. Hardly any snow falls away beneath its paws. The tail continuously adjusts balance against the frozen incline. There is no orchestral tension, no cinematic pursuit. Only wind, dry snow, and distant stone clicks echoing through cliff walls. Then the attack happens with terrifying speed. No long chase follows. No extended pursuit unfolds across the slope. Predator and prey almost instantly disappear from the frame, swallowed by terrain before the viewer can fully understand what happened. The documentary never confirms the kill. The landscape keeps its own secret, because the true climax is not the action itself. It is the revelation. The moment the viewer realizes the predator had been present inside the frame all along, only now becoming visible. The Himalayas do not merely contain the snow leopard. The mountain seems to create it from stone, snow, shadow, and its own freezing wind. Here, predators do not dominate through raw force or aggression. They dominate through invisibility, terrain literacy, oxygen economy, and the art of conserving energy to its absolute limit. And from this moment onward, the documentary fully enters its philosophy of survival minimalism, where the viewer begins to understand that in the Himalayas, the most dangerous thing is often the one that moves the least, makes the least sound, and barely exists until the final moment. Above these silent slopes, the air itself begins to thin enough that even wings must learn new ways to remain alive. The higher the ascent continues, the farther the ground begins to drift away from the narrative of the mountain. The snow-covered slopes where the snow leopard once moved silently through cold stone now sink below like distant geological memories, fractured apart by broken scree fields and dark corridors buried beneath towering cliffs. Space itself begins opening vertically more than horizontally, as though the Himalayas are slowly pulling the world away from its own surface, lifting everything closer toward the cold atmosphere above the weather. Beyond 4,500 meters, vertical canyon walls open between ancient glacier valleys where rivers of cold air slide continuously along the rock like invisible currents. Knife-edge ridges slice through pale skies, while shifting wind channels near the cliff edges constantly change direction according to sunlight. Rock geometry, an ancient cold descending from glaciers thousands of years old. The ground now survives only as distant texture far below. Dark stone cut apart by glaciers into enormous fractures. The air itself has become the true environment, thin, cold, and constantly moving. It never remains still for long between the massive walls of the Himalayas. Even the soundscape transforms completely. No hoof impacts remain against stone. No grass movement drifts through lower winds. No echoes linger close to the talus slopes below. Only prolonged wind shear through canyon openings. Distant turbulence vibrating somewhere beyond sight. Canyon resonance moving slowly between cliff walls, and the sound of air striking wings inside immense silence. The Himalayas do not simply create mountains. They create atmospheric architecture, an invisible terrain system built from temperature, pressure, light, and wind. At elevations where every wing beat consumes precious oxygen, some creatures have learned to stop fighting the atmosphere and instead allow the atmosphere itself to carry them. Between layers of silver cloud and pale gradients of sky dissolving into cold light, a Himalayan griffin appears as a tiny shape above the canyon. It does not fly the way most creatures fly. For long stretches, it barely moves its wings at all, simply rotating slowly inside, rising thermal air, lifting its enormous body higher. With a wingspan capable of exceeding 3 meters, every part of the griffin's anatomy has been built for soaring flight and low-energy travel across thin-air ecosystems. From below, it almost feels as though the bird is not moving across the landscape, but the landscape itself is carrying the creature from one air current into another. Inside the thin atmosphere of the Himalayas, powered flight becomes biologically expensive. The griffin therefore does not battle the atmosphere. It reads the atmosphere. Thermal updrafts rising from sunlit cliff faces become invisible. Wind rivers the bird navigates as part of a larger environmental nervous system, extending far beyond its own body. Survival here does not come through resisting physics, but through cooperating with it. Far below inside glacier valleys, the griffin continuously scans the terrain for carcasses half buried in snow, bodies lost to winter starvation, avalanche deaths, or frozen remains trapped between stone. In the nutrient-poor ecosystems of the Himalayas, scavengers are not merely animals feeding on death. They are nutrient recyclers, decomposition transport systems ensuring energy continues moving through a world where abundance barely exists. Nothing is wasted at this altitude. Nothing is allowed to disappear completely. But not every pair of wings above the Himalayas waits for death. Some carry death themselves. Far along a ridge lined with thin ice, a golden eagle stands near the edge of a sheer cliff, almost motionless as freezing wind pulls gently through the feathers behind its neck. It is entirely different from the griffin. If the griffin uses the atmosphere to survive, the eagle uses the atmosphere to hunt. Its strategy does not rely on long pursuit or wasteful energy expenditure. This remains an oxygen economy ecosystem. Every movement must be precise. Every descent must matter. From its high perch near the cliff edge, the eagle watches faint movements in exposed grass patches, dark burrow entrances beneath alpine slopes, and nearly invisible disturbances no lower creature could ever detect. The Himalayan sky is not empty. It is filled with invisible surveillance paths where predators observe the world below as though gravity itself has become part of vision. Then, when the world beneath becomes nothing more than tiny movement among rock and alpine grass, gravity transforms into a weapon. The golden eagle leaves the cliff without sound. No orchestral violence, no explosive action. Only wind sliced into thin rushing currents, distant turbulence rolling between canyon walls, and a few brief stone echoes rising from the slope below. A pika disappears from the frame almost instantly. The Himalayan narrative does not focus on gore or spectacle. It focuses on the physics of predation. Gravity performs most of the work. The eagle simply adjusts trajectory, timing, and impact angle during the few seconds before everything ends. This is an altitude-assisted hunting system where elevation itself becomes the weapon. Farther below, beneath overhanging rock shelves, young marmots appear briefly near their burrow entrances, before vanishing again, leaving the constant feeling that the ground is always being watched from somewhere above the frame. Ravens and choughs continue circling through cold air near the cliffs. They do not hunt directly, yet their constant presence makes the entire ecosystem feel as though somewhere nearby, death is already moving through the sky. As the sun begins lowering behind glacier ridges, the cold light across the stone fades slowly into pale ash gray. A Himalayan griffin descends beside a carcass partially frozen into an empty slope. There is no feeding frenzy, no abundance, only frozen flesh, wind, silence, and patience. It tears away small pieces from hardened skin, conserving every unnecessary movement, constantly lifting its head to watch the surrounding emptiness as though even feeding itself must obey the energy mathematics of altitude. In high-altitude ecosystems, decomposition happens far more slowly because of cold temperatures, oxygen limitation, and reduced microbial activity. Scavengers therefore become essential to nutrient redistribution across the entire mountain system. The Himalayas do not preserve excess energy. Everything eventually returns to the ecosystem in another form, from frozen carcasses trapped inside glacier valleys to invisible heat currents lifting wings toward the freezing atmosphere above. And then, for one brief instant, the golden eagle vanishes completely from the sky before suddenly reappearing near the ground along a distant slope, leaving the unsettling feeling that the Himalayas themselves always possess eyes above. The sky is not empty. It is filled with invisible movement highways, thermal rivers, and silent predator geometries human beings almost never truly see. The documentary has now fully transitioned from terrestrial survival into atmospheric survival systems. In the Himalayas, even flight must obey energy economy. The creatures that survive the longest are rarely the strongest, but the ones that move the least exploit the environment the most and allow wind, gravity, and atmosphere to perform most of the work for them. But not all hunters descend from the sky. Some continue across the frozen plateaus, carrying hunger over distances too large for ambush alone. Then the Himalayas began changing their own shape. The vertical cliffs slowly disappeared behind the horizon, while the warm rising currents that once carried birds of prey dissolved into the pale cold distance, leaving behind a world no longer governed by height, but by distance. The edge of the Tibetan plateau opened like an ancient ocean frozen millions of years ago, stretching beneath an atmosphere so thin that light itself no longer seemed to touch the ground in the familiar way of lower worlds. Above 4,000 meters, sometimes nearing 5,000, the landscape became almost entirely empty. No forest cover remained, no canyon shelter, no dark cliff walls where life could hide from the cold wind, only hardened gravel plains extending toward the horizon. Frozen steppes shaved into pale layers of dust by the wind. Ridges worn down across millennia by cold air endlessly moving between pressure systems. Snow did not settle heavily across the ground. The wind dragged it into long white streaks, thin as breath dissolving into the air, stretching for kilometers over cracked frozen earth that barely retained heat anymore. By day, ultraviolet radiation poured onto the plateau unobstructed by trees or moisture. By night, temperatures collapsed rapidly across the fully exposed open land. Everything here was uncovered. Everything endured direct exposure to cold, dryness, And distance itself became a kind of invisible biological pressure. Water was rare, shelter was rare, prey was rare, even sound became rare. Only the long wind sliding across the frozen ground remained, snow dust skimming over the soil, and footsteps so distant they vanished into the enormous emptiness before any echo could return. The Himalayas were no longer simply a vertical mountain system. They became horizontal emptiness, a world where life was not crushed instantly by cliffs or altitude, but slowly stretched thin across endless kilometers of cold. And within that vastness, where even movement became expensive, the predators that survived the longest were not the fastest ones, but those that knew how to keep walking the longest. A Tibetan wolf appeared as a tiny figure moving across the frozen plateau. From a distance, it was almost nothing more than a dark blur drifting through the last cold light of day. Its movement was steady, slow, without waste. None of the explosive energy common among predators of lower worlds existed here. No sudden aggression, only an endless walk across a plateau so immense that even time itself seemed to move more slowly. Behind the wolf, footprints stretched across thin snow, repeatedly erased by the wind. Thick fur held warmth against the dry, freezing air, constantly pulling heat away from the body. Its relatively long legs allowed it to continue crossing hardened terrain for hours at a time. Inside that body, the circulatory system had already adapted to an atmosphere where oxygen existed in far smaller amounts than in the lowlands. But the most important adaptation was not in the muscles. It was in the way this animal used energy. Tibetan wolves may travel for kilometers simply to inspect an abandoned burrow cluster, follow cold traces left across a snow crust, or approach a carcass half buried beneath frozen ground. There is no guarantee of reward. Hours of movement sometimes lead to no food at all. This is endurance ecology, where predator survival is governed not by constant action, but by sustainable movement. Every step must be slow enough to extend survival for a few more hours. Every decision must account for how much heat the wind will take away. But on a plateau where visibility stretches too far, every hunt begins as a calculation between distance, oxygen, and the risk of failure. Far along a ridge washed in cold light, a herd of burrell emerged like scattered stone-colored marks against the frozen slope. The distance between predator and prey was so vast that pursuit itself seemed almost impossible. Between them lay only exposed frozen ground, relentless wind, and a landscape entirely without cover. The Tibetan wolf stopped for a very long time. Motionless in the wind, it continuously evaluated slope, difficulty, wind direction, prey awareness, and the energy cost of distance ahead. Cold desert predator ecology does not allow impulsive chases. A pursuit lasting too long may consume more energy than the final meal can replace. Here, survival does not belong to the fastest creature. It belongs to the creature that knows when not to continue. That is the intelligence of restraint. Further below the ridge, several Himalayan marmots stood beside their burrow entrances. They remained frozen in the cold wind before disappearing almost instantly as the wind shifted slightly. Above the plateau's pale sky, ravens drifted silently along wolf roads. They were not companions. They were simply another part of the scavenger system, creatures reading predator movement as a possible sign that somewhere across this immense frozen landscape, death might soon appear. Then the final light of day began lowering itself onto the frozen ground. The Tibetan wolf changed direction. No chase, no combat, no dramatic failure, only a decision to conserve energy. Almost nothing happened in that moment, yet that silence became the first philosophical climax of predator logic within the documentary. The viewer slowly realizes that restraint can matter more than aggression. The Himalayas do not reward unnecessary movement. The plateau continuously steals heat from the body through dry, cold air, endless walking distances, and hours of relentless wind. One small mistake can unfold into a starvation sequence days later. This is an ecosystem of scarcity, an ecosystem operating through biological accounting, where every calorie must be calculated before it is spent. Far across the horizon, the silhouettes of wolves grew smaller inside a space too large for anything to dominate. They did not conquer the landscape. They were almost swallowed by it. In the Himalayas, survival often does not belong to the strongest creatures. It belongs to those that know when to stop. And beneath that enormous emptiness, under wind-eroded soil where predators continue walking for hours in silence, smaller creatures are already listening to movements beneath the frozen ground. At altitudes where the air has become so thin that every sound seems stretched by the cold emptiness of the plateau, the Himalayas begin changing the way they are perceived. The wide-open spaces of the wind-beaten high plateau slowly fade behind the narrative, along with the endless horizon-crossing journeys of larger predators. The world now lowers itself closer to the ground, closer to alpine grasses pressed flat by the wind, closer to scattered frozen soil between silver-grey talus slopes, closer to the countless dark tunnels quietly threading beneath the hardened surface of plateau land above 4,000 meters. The sky remains immense, but it no longer dominates perception entirely. The narrative scale shrinks towards centimeters, toward tiny vibrations beneath the earth, toward nearly invisible movements slipping through tunnel systems below the long frozen ground. The wind here is lower than across the open plateau regions before it. It no longer howls endlessly through space, but glides close to the surface like the thin breath of a world sleeping very deeply. Sound becomes so delicate it nearly disappears. Dry snow brushes softly against frozen soil. Stiff grasses touch one another in tiny collisions. Somewhere beneath the burrow fields, fragmented pika calls rise briefly before dissolving into the cold, thin air. Sometimes there is only the faint sound of loose earth shifting beneath unseen feet. So subtle it feels as though the landscape itself is moving quietly inside its own silence. The Himalayas are no longer observed only through sight. They become a vast listening space, where the ground itself functions as a complex acoustic map. Beneath the low grasses and frozen soil exists an entire underground movement network continuously operating in darkness. The plateau feels like a silent surface concealing countless small creatures moving beneath the cold earth. An ecosystem where life has not vanished, but simply retreated from direct view. And in a world where prey spends most of its existence underground, the most effective predator is no longer the fastest one. It is the one capable of listening the longest. A Tibetan fox appears slowly along the edge of the frozen grassland, almost dissolving into the pale earth tones of the plateau. It does not run. It creates no violent movement. It does not disturb the stillness covering the entire landscape. Its distinctive square-shaped head lowers close to the ground, while small ears rotate constantly in the thin wind. Thick fur protects the body from the year-round dry cold, while its entire form seems evolved for an existence built on extreme energy conservation. This is a predator shaped more for subtlety than strength. At this altitude, where oxygen falls sharply with every rise in elevation, every unnecessary movement becomes biologically expensive. The Tibetan fox does not hunt through prolonged pursuit. It does not explode into chases like many predators of lower regions. Its hunting logic is far simpler, yet far more precise. Wait, listen, detect, strike once. It may stand motionless in the cold wind for long periods simply to hear tiny vibrations beneath the ground. The higher life climbs, the more survival depends on nearly invisible signals like these. A small movement beneath frozen soil, a faint pulse through the earth, an unusual pause between colony calls. In the thin air of the Himalayan plateau, microscopic opportunities determine existence itself. Across the frozen grasslands, countless burrow entrances open like dark fractures across pale ground. Beakers return to the narrative, though no longer as isolated small creatures. They become the core prey network of the plateau ecosystem. Colony systems create a complex acoustic landscape where sharp alarm calls appear briefly before vanishing almost instantly into the cold wind. Those calls do more than warn against predators. They regulate the movement of entire colonies, alter the positioning of nearby prey species, even influence how predators approach the landscape itself. The viewer begins hearing movement underground before seeing animals appear above the surface. In areas where the frozen soil hardens further, vibrations travel even more clearly through the earth, turning the plateau into a vast sensory network. The Tibetan fox reads the landscape through sound and spatial memory more than sight. It remembers burrow locations, wind direction, and the faint vibration patterns moving beneath the soil. A beaker suddenly darts between tunnel entrances before disappearing almost instantly. But the fox does not chase it. It remains still, waiting for the correct distance, waiting for stable wind, waiting for the moment when prey no longer has enough time to return underground. This is no longer hunting through speed. This is hunting through timing. High above the plateau, a golden eagle appears as a tiny dark mark against the pale cold sky. The fox below and the eagle above both depend upon the same fragile source of life. An ecosystem sparse in form, yet bound together by nearly invisible dependencies. Then, within that prolonged silence, the hunt happens almost instantly. The Tibetan fox tilts its head slightly. Its ears rotate in movements nearly impossible to notice. The viewer hears only faint movement beneath frozen soil, loose earth shifting softly, dry grass trembling in the thin wind. Then the fox strikes downward with sudden speed. Powdered snow bursts upward from the frozen ground for a brief moment before settling almost immediately again. No prolonged struggle, no roar, no dramatic chase across the landscape. Only seconds later, the plateau returns to nearly complete silence. The acoustic ambush ends so quickly, it feels as though the Himalayas themselves carried out the hunt through sound pathways, burrow systems, and frozen soil transmitting vibrations beneath the predator's feet. Survival no longer depends on size or dominance. It depends on sensitivity, precision, and the ability to dissolve completely into environmental logic until the animal almost disappears inside the landscape itself. The Himalayas have never been an ecosystem of abundance. The higher the mountains rise, the more they become a precision ecosystem where every species moves less, hunts more selectively, conserves more heat, and dissolves more deeply into the environment. Beyond these scattered colonies and frozen grasslands, the mountains rise once more, toward regions where even shrubs disappear, and stone itself begins to dominate the living world. Above the final shrub zones of the Himalayas, where birdsong still once carried the feeling of an ecosystem breathing somewhere beneath the wind, the landscape begins to change in a way that feels almost absolute. Low grasses slowly disappear from the slopes. The last traces of soft ground give way to ancient moraines, to scree slopes forever slipping downward beneath gravity, to vast glacial debris fields spread across the mountains like the remains of a planet that cooled long ago. Between roughly 4,500 and over 5,000 meters, the forest line no longer arrives as a gradual transition. It vanishes almost abruptly, leaving behind a world stripped of softness, where no canopy remains. No shrub systems hold warmth against the ground. No continuous vegetation survives long enough for the landscape to still feel organically alive. The light changes completely here. It no longer filters through foliage or sinks into dark soil. Everything becomes whiter, colder, sharper. Snow reflects the sun into something almost metallic, bouncing from stone, ice, and dry mineral surfaces, until the entire upper alpine zone begins to feel nearly outside the earth itself. Wind stretches across the ridgelines like ancient sound without an ending, while somewhere far below, the crack of falling rock echoes through a scree basin before dissolving slowly into silence between the mountains. The ground holds heat poorly. Organic material is scarce. Most of the year remains locked in frost. What life survives does so only inside rock fractures that preserve rare traces of moisture, beside thin meltwater trickles that appear briefly beneath midday light, or across tiny exposed patches where snow has retreated just long enough for a thin layer of grass to complete its life cycle before the cold closes in once again. And as forest ecology almost completely disappears, the remaining life must adapt to a system where water, warmth, and growing time are controlled entirely by ice and by cycles of thawing and freezing that repeat nearly every day. Here, glacial ecology begins replacing the role once held by forests. There are no deep root networks stabilizing soil, no thick organic layers regulating nutrient flow, no seasonal abundance capable of sustaining complex food webs. Water exists only as a temporary state between ice and melt. During daylight, meltwater briefly appears along snow edges, slipping through fractures in stone and forming runoff lines so thin they nearly vanish against the rock. But once the sun falls behind the ridges, all of that moisture quickly freezes again beneath the cold of thin air. Permafrost and long frozen ground prevent roots from reaching deep beneath the surface, forcing soil formation to unfold at a pace that feels geological more than biological. Plants here must remain low, seasonal, and relentlessly energy efficient, growing only during a summer so short it no longer resembles a season of abundance. It feels instead like a brief biological permission, a narrow opening where life is allowed to exist before climate closes the door again. Alpine grasses appear like the final living skin stretched across the stone. Lichens cling tightly to mineral surfaces, holding moisture inside microscopic fractures, while slowly breaking rock into the earliest layers of soil through generations of freezing and thawing. Around small melt patches, a few invertebrates emerge rapidly along wet stone edges and thawed seams of earth, only to disappear almost immediately once temperatures fall again. The food web has not vanished completely, but it has been compressed nearly to the lowest limit an ecosystem can sustain. Amid this mineral world, where most of the landscape seems frozen in stillness for thousands of years, one final movement slowly appears across the scree slope. At first, it is nearly impossible to separate from the stone itself. Only when a gray-brown shape shifts slightly within the glacial dust does the slope reveal that life is still present. A group of Himalayan snowcocks stand scattered across the broken terrain, their bodies blending almost entirely into shadow, rock, dust, and the cold light of the upper ridges. They are larger than many alpine birds, with powerful legs adapted for uphill movement across unstable rock fields, forever ready to slide beneath each step. They are not searching for abundance. They rut the landscape for tiny pockets of vegetation, for root fragments still holding warmth, for thin shoots growing beside meltwater seams. At this altitude, every fragment of plant life is more than food. It is stored sunlight. The last remaining warmth summer managed to leave behind before the return of ice. When the sudden sound of falling stone echoes across the basin below, the entire group freezes almost instantly. There is no panicked flight, no explosive reaction like those seen in lower ecosystems. Instead, they begin running uphill, reading the angle of the slope as though it were part of their own bodies, using the broken terrain itself as natural escape geometry. In thin air, sustained flight costs too much energy. Survival here depends not on bursts of speed, but on the ability to read the landscape correctly within a few seconds. Far above them, the shadow of a raptor drifts silently across the pale sky. It does not attack. It simply exists as a constant environmental pressure hanging over the stone world. One bird near the edge of the group opens its wings, glides down toward a lower ravine, and disappears from sight. Then the slope returns to near total emptiness once more, as if life had never been there at all. Above the forest line, biology no longer hides inside habitats. It becomes movement between stone, a shadow crossing scree, a brief sound dissolving into cold wind. The Himalayas no longer feel simply like a living landscape. They resemble an ancient mineral planet where biology survives only as thin interruptions between wind, ice, and rock. Survival no longer resists geology. It negotiates with geology through tiny movements, short directional decisions, and brief pauses between slopes still shifting beneath the cold of thin air country. Farther across the stone fields, where grass appears only in brief summer wounds, larger bodies move slowly, carrying the weight of heat through a country that has almost none. At elevations where dark scree basins and glacial debris fields begin fading into the haze of the thin atmosphere, the Himalayas open into another kind of space entirely wider, emptier, more exposed, as though the whole landscape has been stretched flat beneath an immense cold sky. Vast alpine steppes spread outward beside glacial valleys between 4,500 and 5,500 meters, where broad plateaus continue beyond sight, where sparse grasslands cling to the earth in thin, scattered patches, where frozen wind corridors drive air endlessly across the open ground without ever meeting resistance. Old snow remains scattered across pale stone long after brighter seasons arrive, because heat escapes too quickly here from rock, from soil, from living skin, as though the atmosphere itself is constantly stripping warmth away before it can survive for more than a moment. There are no forests now, no deep rock shadows, no underground burrow systems allowing life to disappear from the wind. The landscape lies fully exposed, so horizontal it almost feels endless. Sound changes here too. The world becomes little more than continuous wind pressure, distant hoofbeats striking frozen earth, and breath torn apart by the cold almost the instant it leaves the lungs. The Himalayas no longer protect life through concealment. Every creature must survive directly within the open atmosphere, fully exposed to wind, cold, and a vastness so immense that existence itself begins to feel fragile. And within that emptiness, where almost no warmth remains, the largest bodies of the thin air ecosystems begin appearing like slow-moving reservoirs of heat crossing an ocean of cold wind. A herd of wild yak emerges across the silver plateau, enormous moving shadows crossing the open landscape beneath the pale light of the high-altitude sun. They are among the largest mammals still surviving at the extreme elevations of the Himalayas and Tibetan Plateau, living across alpine steppes, glacial valleys, and high grasslands where oxygen remains scarce and wind almost never stops. Their bodies are immense, compact, and heavy like extensions of the landscape itself, shaped not for speed or agility, but for the ability to retain warmth inside an atmosphere constantly draining heat from every living surface. Their lungs are far larger than those of many mammals of similar size, allowing greater oxygen uptake in air containing nearly half the oxygen found in the lowlands below. Their hearts are powerful, steady within circulatory systems, shaped over thousands of years for life inside low-oxygen environments. Thick coats hang almost to the ground, trembling continuously beneath the crosswinds, each dense layer trapping warmth like a moving insulation system carrying heat across the exposed plateau. Their breath escapes in brief vapor clouds before dissolving immediately into the wind, leaving the feeling that even the atmosphere itself is trying to erase every sign of living warmth. Yak do not survive through concealment. They are too large to disappear into the landscape and were never built for the precise movement of predator systems. They survive through retained warmth. Alpine grasses, sedges, and sparse vegetation mats scattered across the plateau become the fragile energy source supporting those massive bodies. Through the seasons, the herds move slowly across newly exposed grazing grounds revealed after snow retreat, adjusting their routes according to wind intensity and the remaining patches of vegetation capable of sustaining warmth inside their bodies. But in the Himalayas, mass is not only an advantage. Every kilogram capable of holding heat also demands more food, more oxygen, and greater movement costs inside a landscape where both energy and breathable air remain scarce. Here, large body survival becomes both burden and strength. A massive body retains warmth longer against the cold, yet it also requires more energy inside an ecosystem where plant life has nearly fragmented into isolated traces. And so the herd does not move quickly. It survives through slow movement, low aggression, and near-total body economy. When the yaks stop at an exposed grass patch in the middle of the plateau, there is no violent competition, no sudden conflict. Their massive heads lower together into the wind, slowly pulling thin grass from frozen ground, as though every unnecessary movement has become a form of waste this landscape refuses to tolerate. A young yak moves close beside its mother as stronger wind sweeps across the open side of the plateau. The body of the mother becomes a living wind barrier, preserving precious warmth for the smaller animal still learning how to survive within thin air cold systems. The herd now functions not only as a social structure, but as a thermal system, a defensive geometry, an energy conservation network built through body spacing and collective calm. Strength here is not explosive, it is inertial, slow, heavy, enduring like the plateau itself. Survival becomes the ability to hold warmth longer than the landscape can take it away. Far along the silver horizon, the distant silhouettes of Tibetan wolves appear and vanish within layers of trembling cold air. There is no immediate pursuit, no violent chase sequence, only a distant environmental pressure lingering at the edges of the open ecosystem. The herd does not panic, it does not stampede. The enormous bodies simply gather closer together beneath the growing wind as evening cold slowly settles across the plateau. Stillness becomes a survival strategy. Yak do not dominate the landscape, they almost endure it. The plateau is too vast, too cold, too exposed for aggression to remain sustainable. The Himalayas do not reward excess movement, emotional reaction, or wasted energy. They reward patience, thermal conservation, and collective calm. Across those endless environmental expanses, the land itself remains larger than every creature moving within it, while the giant bodies continue crossing the thin air country like the last remaining reservoirs of warmth inside a world forever losing heat to the endless cold atmosphere. The climax of life here is not confrontation or explosive movement. It is the calmness of enormous bodies facing distant danger. The herd does not run. It compacts, preserves warmth, and continues surviving. Strength is no longer aggression. It becomes collective stillness, the ability to carry warmth across a landscape that can no longer hold any for itself. But not every large body remains awake through the long season of hunger. Other creatures of the Himalayas choose instead to disappear beneath stone and snow, carrying summer inside stored fat until warmth slowly returns to the rock once more. Summer does not leave the upper Himalayas with any clear boundary. There is no sudden seasonal shift, no powerful signal strong enough to divide one world from the next. Only the light growing colder across the plateaus where yak herds once moved through wind-exposed steppe systems. Only the air lingering longer between stone slopes, carrying the feeling that the entire ecosystem is slowing down little by little, like a massive living body beginning to lower its breathing before entering a deep sleep that will last for months. From the open spaces where wind meets nothing but rock and sky, the landscape gradually descends toward alpine meadows near the edges of ancient moraines, where glacial meltwater threads through the grasslands in thin silver streams between elevations of 3,500 and 5,000 meters. The warm season has not fully ended yet, but its bright abundance is already gone. The grasses no longer glow green beneath the thin sunlight of the high atmosphere. They fade into pale yellow, pressed lower against the earth, drier now, as though every blade is trying to preserve the last fragments of energy before the cold seals the ground shut once again. Along the north-facing slopes, the final patches of seasonal snow still remain inside dark shadow zones where sunlight never lingers long enough to fully erase the old winter. Cold gullies hold onto frozen air like cracks leading into an older time than the current season itself. The sound of insect activity has almost vanished from the atmosphere. Silence stretches wider between each gust of wind. Every current moving through the alpine valleys now carries the feeling of biological withdrawal, as though the mountain world is preparing to close itself away from the surface life above the earth. This is not the forest habitat of northern brown bears. There are no dense woodlands here, no lasting abundance, only open terrain exposed entirely to climate, scarce energy, and a brief living season already approaching its end. In the Himalayas, the final warm weeks are not simply the closing of summer. They are the narrow window that determines whether a body will possess enough stored life to cross the winter ahead. And within the little time remaining before the ground freezes again, a large creature begins eating not for the hunger of the present, but for the starvation already approaching from the cold horizon of time. A Himalayan brown bear moves slowly across a slope covered in faded yellow grass beneath the final light of the season. Its pale coat almost disappears into the rocky landscape and dry vegetation surrounding it. This is a brown bear adapted to extreme elevation, living among alpine meadows, rocky mountain zones, and high valleys where thin oxygen makes every movement biologically expensive. It is not presented as an apex aggressor of the high mountains. Its massive body is framed instead as a creature racing against winter day by day, hour by hour, inside an ecosystem where starvation always arrives before visible cold. Its survival logic is simple and merciless. Accumulate enough fat before energy disappears from the landscape. Hyperphagia begins to control nearly every rhythm of the animal's existence. It searches constantly across rocky slopes, overturning cold stones, digging deep into the ground layer already stiffening beneath falling nighttime temperatures. Large claws drive into the earth with movements that are heavy yet precise, wasting no energy. Its breath thickens visibly inside the cold afternoon air, short bursts of white dissolving quickly into the wind. It feeds on the last grasses of the season, roots still buried beneath frozen soil, rare berries not yet locked by frost, insects hidden inside stone cracks, carrion when it can be found, and marmots storing energy underground. Hibernation here is not the peaceful sleep humans imagine. It is a metabolic retreat from starvation, from the collapse of energy during the many months when the mountain surface can no longer support enough biomass for survival. But within Himalayan ecosystems, late-season energy never appears randomly. Other creatures are also preparing for winter through their own systems of storage, and those reserves gradually become survival targets for larger bodies. Colonies of Himalayan marmots appear around burrow fields near moraine edges, where alpine grasslands still retain traces of late-season warmth. Throughout the brief, warm months, marmots feed almost continuously to accumulate fat for the long hibernation ahead. They extend tunnel networks deep beneath the earth and stone, building natural thermal systems that help them avoid predators, resist the cold, and preserve life when the world above is sealed beneath snow. Inside this declining energy landscape, those burrow systems become hidden, seasonal energy nodes beneath the ground. Sharp alarm calls echo briefly before the wind pulls them apart across the cold open space. The bear stops. The wind shifts gently across the yellow slope. Slowly, it turns toward the faint movement beneath the earth. This is not simply the search for food. It is a collision between two survival systems sharing the same vanishing stretch of time. The marmot stores energy to survive winter below the ground. The bear needs that stored energy if its own body is to disappear into months of deep sleep ahead. Then the ground itself begins participating directly in the final search of the season. Cold soil bursts upward in dark fragments against dead grass as the bear digs forcefully into the edge of a burrow. No orchestral tension appears, no violent pacing. Only the dry heaviness of digging sounds, deep breathing in thin air, and the distant wind moving endlessly through valleys growing colder by the hour. Beneath that quiet cadence lies immense biological urgency. Late-season alpine ecology operates like a clock running out of energy. Green biomass disappears day by day. Insect activity declines. Exposed forage becomes increasingly rare. Every feeding opportunity is no longer ordinary behavior. It becomes survival mathematics inside an ecosystem closing itself before winter. No explicit kill appears. Only marmot calls suddenly falling silent. Only the bear walking slowly away from the burrow field with dark soil still clinging to its muzzle. Yet somewhere beneath that silence, winter has already begun to exist long before the first heavy snows arrive. In the Himalayas, climax does not always exist inside violence. Sometimes it exists in the way two survival systems collide beneath the pressure of time. One creature stores energy to sleep through the dead silence of the mountains. Another must find that stored energy if it hopes to enter its own deep retreat. And winter, though still absent from the ground itself, has already become the invisible antagonist standing behind the entire landscape. The viewer gradually understands that at these elevations, the final weeks of summer may determine the many months that follow. Survival is not only adaptation to terrain, altitude, or oxygen scarcity. It is also the ability to sense the remaining time before starvation season arrives. The ability to prepare for a prolonged disappearance from the living world above the surface of the earth. And when winter takes what summer cannot protect, the mountain does not waste the dead. Above the slopes, another creature waits for what remains after hunger has finished speaking. Above the final alpine grasslands, where Baral once crossed the last surviving strips of short grass beneath the thin light of late summer, the world begins changing into a form of unfinished terrain. Animal trails gradually disappear between cold fields of broken stone, through avalanche-fed valleys crushed by ancient ice, along moraine ridges only recently pushed upward from beneath the mountain itself. Beyond 5,000 meters, the Himalayas no longer resemble a familiar ecosystem, but a mineral planet still reshaping itself in silence. From a distance, glaciers stretch between dark cliffs like frozen white rivers suspended in time, motionless to the human eye, yet never truly still. Beneath that cold crust, reflecting violent light, the entire ice mass continues sliding downward, centimeter by centimeter each day, grinding stone into mineral dust, dragging sediment through the valleys, opening and burying temporary habitats, again and again beneath new ice and fresh collapse. No clear vegetation structure remains on this landscape. No grazing systems, no recognizable movements of large animals, only unstable scree extending beneath sharp, reflected light from wet mineral surfaces and thin meltwater seams trembling across fractured ice. Sound here no longer comes from life, but from geology itself. Deep cracking echoes from inside the glacier, like enormous ancient timber breaking somewhere within the mountain. Low wind moves along moraine ridges in a dark, endless tone. Beneath the thick ice, meltwater still flows unseen through the cold darkness of subglacial channels. But as the perspective lowers further, as the world is no longer experienced at the scale of mountains, but at the scale of meltwater, mineral dust, and ice fractures only centimeters wide, the seemingly lifeless landscape begins revealing another layer of existence, so small it almost falls beyond ordinary human perception. The glacier surface is not entirely white. Across the ancient ice lie thin bands of dark mineral dust, cryoconite sediments gathered inside shallow ice depressions, and microbial films so faint they only appear when low light reflects across damp frozen surfaces. Deep crevasses release a cold blue glow, as though the entire mountain were illuminated from within. During the day, meltwater appears for only a few brief hours beneath the thin sunlight of altitude. By night, it freezes again. Freeze-thaw cycles continue endlessly, opening and erasing, rebuilding and destroying microscopic habitat windows that survive for less than a single day. Ice here does not sustain life through warmth or abundance. It sustains life through instability. That temporary instability creates moisture films thin enough for microorganisms to survive, nutrient movement delicate enough for microscopic systems to continue functioning along the frozen edge of the planet. Inside those layers of meltwater only millimeters deep, creatures almost never seen by human eyes continue moving through ice-edge sediment and wet mineral pockets. Cold-tolerant midges crawl across frozen surfaces instead of flying into the violent freezing air above them. Tiny glacier larvae, related to the Diomesa group, survive inside dark subglacial melt channels where thin streams carry bacteria, microbial mats, and blue-green algae through black sediment. Springtails, cold-adapted mites, and microscopic alpine beetles move so slowly they nearly disappear into the mineral world beneath them. Many species rarely leave the glacier surface because every centimeter higher means stronger wind shear, harsher freezing airflow, and faster heat loss. Some continue functioning at temperatures near or even below freezing, not because they resist the cold, but because their entire biology has been forced by evolution to exist around the permanent presence of ice and temporary meltwater. These are not the famous glacier ice worms of North America. The Himalayas hold a different microfauna, smaller, harder to see, far quieter, yet equally bound to the freezing and thawing rhythms of glacial ice. If meltwater arrives too early, microbial productivity collapses. If freeze periods last too long, habitat windows vanish entirely. Life here survives at the very edge of climatic time, But even these tiny organisms are not the true foundation of the system. Beneath them, across the seemingly dead glacier surface itself, older microbial worlds continue operating in near total silence. Snow algae appear as pale red or dark green traces, almost invisible within thin moisture films across the ice. Microbial mats cling to meltwater seams, sediment pockets, and tiny cryoconite holes scattered like dots across the enormous white mineral field. They absorb weak high-altitude light and survive inside water layers, approaching lethal thresholds for most life on Earth. These microbes form the first foundation of the glacial food web. They feed larvae, mites, springtails, and countless microscopic grazers. Those tiny invertebrates then become nutrient transfer systems for opportunistic alpine birds and downstream ecosystems far below the cold valleys. Avalanche corridors carry sediment, organic fragments, and carcass nutrients from upper slopes into lower valleys, transforming the glacier from a frozen wasteland into a massive moving ecological engine. So slow, humans mistake it for stillness, yet powerful enough to redistribute living matter across the entire mountain range. And when the perspective rises once more beyond those fragile meltwater seams, the ecosystem that briefly revealed itself almost disappears again from human awareness. Powerful winds continue moving along glacier walls and moraine ridges. Cloud shadows drift slowly across endless debris fields of ice and stone. All microbial films, tiny invertebrates, and delicate meltwater flows immediately vanish back into the immensity of the landscape. The places that seem most dead still contain life. The coldest spaces still sustain fragile food webs functioning in silence. The Himalayas no longer feel like a conventional ecosystem, but like a planetary process accidentally continuing to generate life through the movement of ice, stone, minerals, and ancient climatic time. The climax of this landscape does not exist in predators, chases, or survival drama. It exists in perceptual inversion. The glacier crushes habitat while quietly nourishing microbial life and hidden nutrient webs within the destruction itself. For the first time, the realization becomes unavoidable. Life does not disappear from the Himalayas as altitude rises. It simply becomes smaller, quieter, and nearly invisible. Above the tree line, the world does not become emptier. It becomes more mineral, colder, smaller, and harder to see. Survival is compressed into microbial films thin as dust, into meltwater seams lasting only hours, into nutrient particles carried through ancient ice and wind. At this point, the documentary itself moves beyond traditional wildlife storytelling into something far larger, a planetary ecological perception where life is no longer measured through visible movement or scale, but through the ability to endure inside conditions that barely allow life to exist at all. Beyond the glaciers, the mountain rises into a thinner silence, where even this narrow web begins to fade. And the question is no longer how life survives the cold, but how it survives the absence of breath itself. Above the last glacier ecosystems of the Himalayas, above the moraine systems where rock and ice still retain the familiar shapes of earthly terrain, the documentary begins leaving behind the final world where life can still hold onto the ground. The camera pushes higher into the upper Himalayan air corridors, where the landscape slowly loses every detail that once allowed the human mind to recognize it as a planet below. Vegetation disappears first. Then the texture of the terrain fades away. The mountain chains become nothing more than black ridgelines buried far beneath a slow-moving ocean of white cloud drifting under cold, silver-blue light. Ice summits rise through the cloud layers like the last fragments of stone remaining along the edge of the atmosphere itself. Above them, the sky no longer carries the familiar blue of lower elevations. It deepens into a thinner, colder shade of darkened blue-black, where the atmosphere becomes too fragile to hold onto the warmth of the human world. At altitudes between 6,000 and 7,000 meters, sometimes even higher during the longest migration crossings, the Himalayas no longer exist as a mountain ecosystem. They become an atmospheric barrier system, a wall of air where oxygen functions as a scarce survival resource, no different from food, water, or heat. The air here is brutally cold and painfully dry, constantly stripping moisture away from every exposed living surface. The light is so sharp and white that the edges of ice-covered rock almost seem to glow inside the thin frozen air. The soundscape collapses into little more than deep wind, sheer dragging across invisible ridgelines, distant turbulence echoing from atmospheric layers colliding somewhere far above, and long stretches of near-space silence, broken only by the rare rhythm of wings moving through the sky. Then, inside air that is almost too thin for most mammals to remain active at all, the first silhouettes begin appearing above the cloud layers. A formation of bar-headed geese stretches across the cold dark sky above the weather systems. They do not fly quickly. Nothing about them feels dramatic. There is no aggression, no triumph, no sense of conquest. The movement of the flock resembles a biological current, attempting to preserve a stable rhythm of existence inside an atmosphere that seems fundamentally hostile to complex life. These are among the highest flying birds ever known on Earth. Every migration season, they travel between the Tibetan Plateau and the warmer wetlands farther south across Asia, crossing the Himalayas not through explosive power, but through sustained endurance, pacing inside severely oxygen-starved air. Their blood carries hemoglobin capable of binding oxygen far more efficiently than that of many other birds. Their respiratory systems operate with extraordinary efficiency in hypoxic conditions. Their flight muscles contain dense networks of capillaries that deliver oxygen to working tissues faster and more effectively. Even the mitochondria inside their cells sit closer to the cell membranes themselves, allowing oxygen diffusion to continue functioning in an environment where every molecule of oxygen becomes precious. But the documentary never presents these adaptations as biological victory. Everything dissolves into the rhythm of movement itself. The wing beats remain steady, slow, and so energy efficient, they become almost hypnotic. There is no explosive flight, no sensation of breaking free from gravity, only continuation through thin air. One wing beat, a long silence, then another. Every movement is measured against the tightening limits of oxygen surrounding their bodies. At this altitude, even continuing to flap their wings means losing water with every breath. Frozen dehydration never stops as the extremely dry atmosphere pulls moisture from respiratory surfaces and exposed tissues facing the cold wind. Jet stream winds occasionally lift the migration path higher with less energy expenditure, but a sudden shift in crosswinds can pull the entire formation away from its optimal alignment, forcing each bird to burn more energy simply to hold its place within the collective movement. There are no predators here, no territorial conflict, no hunting systems. The Himalayas challenge life through the absence of breathable air itself. The atmosphere becomes an invisible survival filter. Only highly specialized physiology can continue functioning inside air that is approaching the biological limits of complex life. Far below the flight path, the ground world begins dissolving from perception entirely. Glacier systems lie buried beneath a silver-white cloud ocean. Black ridges stretch beneath them so far away, they resemble fractures across the surface of another planet. Thin cloud layers now drift below the birds themselves. Slowly, the documentary creates the realization that they are flying above the weather. Far beneath the ridgelines, a few choughs appear as tiny black specks circling through lower cliff turbulence. The sheer distance makes the bar-headed geese feel as though they have left conventional bird territory altogether, entering a near-space atmosphere where the sky no longer belongs to the ecosystems of the ground below. One bird slips slightly behind the formation as a stronger crosswind arrives ahead, but there is no panic, no abrupt correction. The flock adjusts slowly, each movement conserving as much energy as possible, as though every bird understands that unnecessary effort could become a survival limit. Migration at this altitude contains no dramatic triumph. It is not a spectacle of power. It is continuation through physiological exhaustion, a form of endurance flight taking place near the limits of biology itself. Every wingbeat exists inside conditions where most mammals could barely remain active for long. Survival is no longer determined by competition or predator avoidance. Survival becomes nothing more than continued movement through oxygen scarcity. And here, the documentary pushes the Himalayas beyond ecological mountain storytelling and into atmospheric existentialism. The climax is not found in storms, attacks, or collapse. It exists in the realization that the atmosphere itself can become an ecological barrier. The bar-headed geese do not conquer the Himalayas. They simply continue moving through air that is almost impossible to breathe, sustaining motion long enough for life to cross the frozen emptiness of the upper atmosphere. The viewer begins to understand that survival in the Himalayas is not only about enduring cold, finding food, or avoiding predators. Here, survival also means continuing to move when the air itself is nearly no longer enough for life. At this point, the documentary fully expands beyond mountain ecology into near-space biological storytelling, where the atmosphere is no longer an empty space between creatures and sky, but an ancient, selective force deciding which forms of life can still exist above Earth's weather layer. Yet above even these migrations, there are cliffs where almost nothing nests, where the wind never truly stops, and where smaller birds survive by learning how to live inside the mountain's turbulence itself. Above the migration corridors, where the geese once crossed wide oceans of cloud through almost unimaginable endurance, the Himalayas continue lifting the world into another layer of atmosphere, where the sky no longer feels open, but pressed tightly against stone. Summit ridges emerge like steep black spines suspended inside constantly moving air. Between 5,000 and 7,000 meters, the world becomes almost entirely vertical, exposed to wind, cold, and instability as though the atmosphere here has never remained calm long enough for life to fully settle into it. Narrow snow-covered ledges hang above dark abysses. Cornices curve slightly beneath the weight of ancient ice. Black fractures cut through the cliff faces like cracks across a frozen ocean formed long before humanity ever appeared. But here, it is the air itself that becomes the most active structure in motion. Wind is no longer background sound behind the landscape. It becomes a physical current system. Air changes direction constantly as it collides with sharp ridgelines, creating invisible pockets of turbulence. Sudden updrafts rising from the cliff walls, followed immediately by violent crosswind bursts, cold enough and strong enough to throw any creature out of stable flight. The Himalayas now feel like an atmospheric ocean made of stone, where every movement must negotiate with the air before it can survive. The only sounds remaining are wind striking the rock faces, the thin slicing noise of wings cutting through low oxygen air, and hollow echoes deep inside frozen crevices. At this altitude, survival no longer depends on speed or strength. It depends on the ability to read instability correctly. And then, inside the white turbulence endlessly crashing against the dark ridges, two small black shapes begin to appear, not resisting the turbulence, but almost living within it. Yellow-billed choughs and red-billed choughs glide across the cliff systems like fragments of darkness so light they seem almost untouched by gravity. Their bodies are small, agile, and perfectly tuned for thin alpine air. Their wings are long enough to remain stable inside turbulence, yet sensitive enough to shift direction almost instantly whenever the airflow changes. Unlike eagles or vultures, creatures sustained through body mass and the dominance of soaring flight, choughs do not survive through power. They survive through precision. A pair of choughs dives close beside a dark cliff wall, disappearing for several seconds beneath the edge of stone before an updraft lifts them back into the air with almost no additional wing beats. Their wings twitch only slightly, minimally, as though unnecessary movement has been removed from their biology over countless generations. The landscape behind them never feels stable. Air currents continuously collide against the mountainsides, making the entire space feel as though creatures are being tossed between invisible layers of atmosphere. But the choughs never panic. They constantly adjust wing angles, spread their tails slightly, and tilt their bodies with each subtle change in turbulence. Every correction happens almost simultaneously with the motion of the wind itself, so quickly that the boundary between bird and airflow begins to disappear. The longer the viewer watches, the clearer it becomes that these birds are not truly flying through the Himalayas. They are reading the air the way other creatures read terrain. Updrafts rising from the cliff faces become invisible survival corridors beyond human sight. Choughs do not fight turbulence. They exploit it. A sudden blast of wind sweeps across a ridge edge, nearly pulling one bird away from stable flight. Yet within the same instant, it tilts its wings, changes body angle, and slides back into a more stable airflow corridor, as though the structure of the surrounding air had already been memorized. The intelligence here does not lie in controlling the environment. It lies in adapting to continuous instability. Thin wind reduces flight stability, yet simultaneously creates moments of lift that exist for only a few seconds at a time. The Himalayas do not only create cliffs, they create atmospheric architecture, a constantly shifting aerodynamic structure moving around stone and ice. The choughs almost seem to dance inside those moving currents. One bird lands beside a wet ledge near melting snow. It quickly gathers tiny larvae clinging to the moisture film. A few alpine insects newly emerged beside the thin water layer, fragments of organic matter trapped near an old snowfield. At this altitude, no nutrient is wasted. Even the smallest traces left behind near old climbing routes can become usable energy. The feeding ecology of choughs is entirely opportunistic. They survive through extremely brief feeding windows that appear and disappear alongside temperature, light, and airflow. Survival now depends on perfect timing, on memorizing airflow, on reading environmental change faster than the environment changes itself. Then the cloud mist slowly begins swallowing the summit ridges. The small black shapes disappear into the shifting white around the cliff edges. The world returns to near emptiness once more, leaving only wind, silver-white turbulence, and the deep, cold silence of stone. The climax of this high-altitude world is not found in storms or pursuit. It exists in the realization that turbulence itself can become habitat. Choughs do not conquer the wind. They survive by correctly reading its instability. And by now, the Himalayas no longer resemble a mountain range at all. They resemble an ancient atmospheric ecosystem where life can survive only inside impossibly fragile corridors of suitable airflow, where survival no longer depends on territory or abundance, but on aerodynamic precision, on nutrient windows so small they are almost invisible, on the ability to understand the moving language of cold air against stone. And even here, where wings still cross the ridges, life continues farther downward into the snow itself, into colors and movements too small to be seen from any human distance. Above the cold air currents where the last birds can still glide through the cliff winds, the Himalayas begin to lose the familiar shape of mountains altogether. Valleys disappear, ridges dissolve. Even the feeling of a landscape stretching beneath the sky slowly fades away. Beyond 5,500 meters, the world contracts into fields of ice crystals, reflecting a cold white light so intense it nearly erases depth itself. The entire snow surface becomes a microscopic desert of frozen grains, thin films of meltwater threading silently between layers of ice, mineral dust carried upward from distant cliffs below, and tiny shifting shadows trembling softly across the snow beneath the pale sunlight of the upper atmosphere. The snowfields near the glacier edges exist in almost complete silence. Only the faint sound of ice softening beneath daylight remains, along with movements too small to truly hear microfilms of water slipping through crystal layers. Distant winds echoing far above from unseen cliff systems. The light here carries no warmth. It is white, sharp, relentless against every surface, turning the entire world into something that feels suspended inside endless ice and thinning air. The higher the elevation rises, the harder life becomes to see. No large bodies move across the landscape anymore. No predator silhouettes cut across the slopes. The Himalayas now approach the very edge of the biosphere itself, where most recognizable forms of life have vanished from human sight. And yet within the snow that appears completely sterile, color slowly begins to emerge, as though the ice itself were quietly photosynthesizing beneath the cold sun. Across the snow surface near melt zones, pale pinks, deep reds, and faint traces of green begin to appear where crystal layers soften into water. Snow algae survive inside ultra-thin liquid films trapped between melting snow grains, creating patterns that from a distance look like tiny stains frozen within the ice. But under macro scale, the entire surface opens into a drifting microscopic ocean beneath the ultraviolet light of high altitude. Here, where the atmosphere has grown too thin to block most ultraviolet radiation, the red and orange pigments inside the algae cells become a biological shield. They absorb harsh radiation, reduce oxidative stress, and allow photosynthesis to continue during the brief moments when temperatures rise just enough for meltwater to remain liquid. This is no longer plant life in the familiar sense of the ecosystems below. It is photosynthetic persistence at physical limits, life surviving only through a few narrow hours of suitable light before temperatures collapse again, and biological activity retreats almost immediately toward dormancy. Under the macro lens of silence, algae cells drift between mineral particles like tiny planets suspended inside meltwater. Thin microbial films spread quietly across the snow surface, forming the first nutrient layer of this nearly invisible ecosystem. And within that fragile biological color, even smaller lives begin to move. Tiny springtails leap across narrow meltwater gaps in jumps almost impossible to notice at human scale. Small mites crawl slowly between melting snow grains, as though their entire world were nothing more than a maze of ice crystals and vanishing streams of water. The organisms living along these meltwater seams survive almost entirely through timing. A slight shift in sunlight, the passing shadow of a cloud high above, is enough to collapse the surface temperature almost instantly. Freeze-thaw cycles repeat across the snow every day. For a few moments beneath direct sunlight, thin water layers appear between crystal grains. Microbial motion returns, nutrient films awaken, and tiny arthropods begin searching for rare traces of organic matter drifting across the surface. But the moment clouds cover the sun, temperatures plunge again. Motion slows. Biological activity contracts back toward near-frozen stillness. The Himalayas are no longer an ecosystem of territory. There are no vast hunting grounds anymore, no food chains stretching across landscapes. This becomes an ecosystem of temporary permission, where life exists only during the brief moments the environment allows it. At the boundary where snow begins to melt before freezing once again, a small spider appears along the crusted surface. Its body is nearly swept away whenever stronger winds spill across the glacier edge. It does not build large webs like the species lower down the mountain. The world here is too unstable, too wind-beaten, too poor in nutrients for permanent structures to survive. It feeds on micro-insects, airborne organic fallout, and rare fragments of biological debris carried upward from ecosystems far below. The thin air makes every movement more difficult. Retaining moisture becomes a constant survival risk. Yet along these brief meltwater seams, temporary hunting windows still open for a few fragile minutes before the ice seals shut once more. The spider moves slowly across the hardened snow, carrying none of the image of a dominant predator. It feels, instead, like the final arthropod still holding its place at the edge of an atmosphere barely capable of supporting life, where even the act of hunting has become as fragile as the thin water film beneath its feet. Then the light begins to fade behind layers of cold cloud. Surface temperatures fall almost immediately. Meltwater films contract back into ice. Microbial motion slowly disappears. Even the spider's tiny tracks across the snow crust are gradually erased beneath the wind. The entire microscopic world seems to lock itself back inside the ice. And when the camera finally pulls away from the microbial films, from the spider tracks, and the almost invisible movements hidden inside the snow, the endless white snowfield once again appears nearly empty. The Himalayas return to the image of a frozen landscape without signs of life. But now, the viewer understands that the snow itself is alive. What once felt sterile, frozen, and lifeless is in fact holding photosynthetic activity. Microscopic food webs, tiny predators, and nutrient systems existing within biological films only microns thick. Survival here is no longer measured by seasons or even by days. It depends on a few brief minutes of suitable temperature, a thin layer of water that remains unfrozen just long enough, a short interval of light beneath the cold atmosphere of the Himalayas. The higher the mountain rises, the smaller life becomes, more temporary, more fragile, closer to physical limits. By now, the documentary has fully crossed into the ecology of the biosphere's edge, where the Himalayas are no longer empty, but nearly invisible with life. And above these fading traces, beyond even the drifting life within the snow, one last predator still moves across the upper stone, where hunting itself becomes a struggle against the mountain. Above the final layers of cloud, the Himalayas no longer appear as a mountain range that humans can name, measure, conquer, or place onto maps. The valleys have disappeared far below. Villages, monasteries, expedition camps, footprints, and every familiar trace of human presence dissolve into distance. Only summit ridges remain above the cloud layers, silent ice plateaus, wind-carved snowfields shaped through countless seasons, and vast regions of cold, suspended light hanging inside the thin atmosphere, where the landscape has been reduced almost entirely to stone, ice, wind, and the pale reflection of snow. Clouds drift beneath the mountains like slow white ocean currents, folding through valleys that have long since lost their shape, while the horizon fades into the glare of snow and the thin haze of high air. Here, the Himalayas are no longer only a mountain range. They become a climate architecture, a structure of geological time, an atmospheric mechanism older than every civilization that once moved beneath them. Wind is the final force still governing everything, passing through cornices, ridges, and glacier walls, creating deep, resonant vibrations before leaving behind intervals of near-total silence between each gust, as though the entire planet were breathing slowly through ice. Inside this space, almost beyond ordinary perception of life itself, the creatures encountered throughout the journey begin to appear one final time, no longer as central characters, but as temporary traces inside a world far older than they are. The beaker survives through short movements, through timing, through restraint after each alarm call. Barrel do not overcome the cliffs with speed, but by borrowing the geometry of stone. Himalayan tar move across vertical terrain as though they are extensions of the mountain itself. Wild yak conserve warmth inside massive bodies beneath the cold wind. Tibetan wolves cross emptiness through patience. Snow leopards hunt through silence, waiting, and the careful economy of terrain, choughs read invisible air currents instead of conquering the sky. Bar-headed geese cross the atmosphere through endurance rather than explosive strength. Glacier insects and microbial snow algae awaken only during brief windows of thaw, when meltwater, sunlight, and temporary warmth align just long enough for biology to open its eyes for a few fleeting moments. Nothing here survives through excess. The Himalayas do not reward aggression, waste, or constant movement. They permit only forms of life that know how to conserve, remain silent, and reduce the cost of every breath. Survival here is not conquest. It is negotiated existence, a fragile agreement between body and altitude, between blood and oxygen, between borrowed warmth and winters always longer than life wishes them to be. Silence, then, is no longer merely atmospheric background. It becomes a biological strategy. Predators move quietly to avoid wasting energy and exposing themselves to prey. Prey freeze in place instead of fleeing immediately, because one mistake may consume the heat needed to survive the coming night. Birds glide more than they flap, reducing the cost of wing beats inside thin air. Mammals shrink movement, slow respiration, avoid every unnecessary action. Even the organisms hidden within the ice operate almost invisibly, as though life itself has learned to survive by creating as little disturbance as possible. Behind that silence lies an even deeper system of calculation. Every footstep, every hunt, every wing beat, every gram of fat, every migration route, every breeding season becomes a biological expense. The Himalayas do not function through abundance. They function through deficit, conservation, and thermal economy. A failed hunt may lead directly to starvation. A storm can break apart the formation of birds crossing the clouds. A single short week of thaw may determine microbial activity, alpine flowering, and feeding windows for herbivores. At this altitude, survival is never stable, never guaranteed, never permanent. Every organism is merely borrowing warmth, borrowing oxygen, borrowing summer, borrowing time from the mountain. And the higher the elevation rises, the more the Himalayas resemble an ancient evolutionary filter. Most life is stopped by hypoxia, ultraviolet radiation, cold, dehydration, and scarcity. Only the quieter, lighter, slower, more efficient, and more enduring species continue beyond the cloud layers. With every increase in altitude, the mountain removes more biomass, more oxygen, more vegetation, more warmth, more movement, more sound, until the peaks no longer resemble mountains at all, but geological structures piercing through the atmosphere, standing still across spans of time longer than any human language. Far away along a summit ridge, a snow leopard appears briefly. No hunting sequence, no dramatic reveal, only a small shadow crossing the edge of snow before vanishing behind stone. Even the apex predator is merely a temporary visitor of altitude. Beneath the cornices, choughs drift through cliff turbulence, sometimes lifted above the rock edge by invisible currents, becoming the final movements inside an almost motionless landscape. Farther still, a formation of bar-headed geese crosses above the cloud layers, no longer resembling animals so much as atmospheric signals, thin strokes moving through the pale air. Across a final snowfield at the end of the day, faint pink microbial algae glow softly against the ice, reminding us that even here, biology still clings to meltwater, sunlight, and temporary warmth. And then everything begins to withdraw from form. The entire Himalayan range opens into an immense final view, clouds flowing beneath the summit lines, while only the resonance of wind continues across the ice. An old footprint near a ridge, a fragment of bone half covered in snow, a tuft of yak fur caught against stone, the frozen entrance to a burrow. All of them are merely evidence of passing life. No creature owns this mountain. They exist only within temporary biological permissions, occasionally granted by altitude. The Himalayas existed before civilization, before borders, before language, before maps. They are not a place to conquer. They are a biological filter, a climate engine, an atmospheric frontier, a geological system of survival. Every living thing here, from pika, yak, wolf, snow leopard, and bar-headed goose to microbial algae buried within the snow, is only a temporary biological event inside geological time. Above the clouds, the mountain does not remember us. It remembers only wind, ice, stone, and the brief passing of living things learning for a moment how to breathe beside the sky.